Hello and good afternoon friends, welcome to the CEC-UGC live lecture. Dear friends, as you know that we are carrying a series on Indian political thought and we have conducted numerous sessions under this series. Dear friends, as we are talking about the political thoughts of various thinkers, today we would be talking on the political thoughts of Abu Fazl. Dear friends, we would like to tell you all that for this very discussion on the political thought of Abul Fazl, we have once again with us in our studios Dr. Satish Kumar Jha. Dr. Satish Kumar Jha is Associate Professor in Aryabhatta College, University of Delhi. Dr. Jha has immense experience and we believe that her knowledge as well as experience would definitely help us out in understanding this topic in detail. So I would like to welcome our guest, Dr. Satish Kumar Jha. Dr. Jha, welcome to the UGC lecture.
Thank you, Geetika ji. Good afternoon. Today's lecture we are going to devote on political thought of Abu Fazl, a medieval political thinker in India, a companion, advisor, fellow traveler of great Mughal Emperor Akbar. In fact, so far as the medieval political thought is concerned, normally, in political thought and in social sciences, two important thinkers of the medieval period are normally considered for their, range, for their, erudition, and for their the range, the kind of ideas which they propounded. One was Barani. Who of course belonged to a different period, that was Sultanate period. Another was Abu Fazl. In fact, both were separated by 250 years, almost 250 years, and there was of course a lot of difference between the two in terms of their approach, in terms of their writings, in terms of their ideological inclination and so on and so forth. But still these two thinkers, Barani and Fazl are, at times compared, they are studied, and sometimes, scholars try to, portray them as representing two different traditions of Islamic thought, so far as, medieval Indian political thought is concerned. Now we will touch upon these issues, particularly Barani and Fazl. In fact, Barani, about whom we have had discussion earlier in our earlier lecture, we had seen that how Barani's context was different, how Barani was basically dealing with a situation of Sultanate, establishment in India, and therefore the question of stability, the question of hierarchy, the question of nobility, the internal strife among, in that class, the class of nobles. All these issues basically troubled him, and therefore he at times reflected on these issues. Whereas in Abu Fazl, we find altogether a different genre of writing. Of course, in fact, for understanding Akbar, his policy of tolerance, for overall pattern of administration and governance in that period, Abu Fazl's writings are considered quite significant, and many scholars go back to Abu Fazl for interpreting Akbar's regime and Akbar's policies. But irrespective of that, Abu Fazl's ideas are in themselves quite significant from the point of view of the policy of tolerance which Akbar is normally associated with, for overall discourse on political authority, sovereignty, state system, and so on and so forth. And interestingly, in medieval period, the contract theory, the social contract theory was not quite popular. In fact, even in West, the social contract theory emerged much later. That was basically 17th century with Hobbes. But here we find in 16th century, an Indian political thinker, Abu Fazl, talking about social contract so far as the origin of the state is concerned. He is basically talking of sovereignty in a different light. For example, he is not talking of divine origin theory of sovereignty. Rather, he is basically locating it in the contract among the people and the societal needs. So therefore, there are a lot of movement away from the established understanding about power, authority, state, and so on and so forth. We will basically look at all these issues in course of our discussion. One thing is very significant so far as Barani and Fazl I was referring to, that Barani's writings, scholars believe that are much more lively and suggestively, with suggestive clarity, whereas Abu Fazl's writings, it is normally stated, are ambiguous in terms of assertions. But at the same time, it is also stated that Abu Fazl writings are more philosophical and basically rational in nature, whereas Barani's writings are equated with theocratic discourse or a discourse in theology, where basically he considered Shariat laws and other things as the main important reference point for governance and so on and so forth. So, in fact, with this preliminary difference between Barani and Fazl, we will get back to this issue even later in course of our discussion. Two things we should remember, and this is important not only for Abu Fazl, for any thinker, whether Indian or Western. One is the life and another is the parentage. What kind of upbringing a particular thinker has had sometimes becomes quite significant for understanding his or her political thought. Now, Abu Fazl's life, of course, interestingly, much is known about his life through his own pen. Instead of relying on the biographies, we have to simply look at some of the writings which Abu Fazl produced, and therefore, in fact, this is one of the important sources through which one can construct the life sketch of Abu Fazl. Now, some of the ideas you also get from his critics, and one such critique was Abdul Barani, who was not a critique of Abu Fazl, but he was also the critique of his father Sheikh Mubarak of Nagaur, which is basically today's Rajasthan. So, therefore, his father Sheikh Mubarak also invited a lot of criticism because of a kind of approach which he adopted, and therefore, in fact, father's influence on the son, that is Abu Fazl, was quite significant. So much so that in fact Abu Fazl didn't have a proper tutor or any teacher till the age of 20, and in fact whatever knowledge he attained was basically largely from his father. So, his father was his first and perhaps the most important tutor in his life. Now, apart from Barani and apart from Abu Fazl's own writings, in fact, we also get to know about Abu Fazl's through some recent studies, and particularly two of them can be basically singled out here. One is by H. Blockman and another is S. Athar Abbas Rizvi. So, these two contemporary, or one can say not contemporary but the recent writings, in fact recent writings or recent studies on Abu Fazl are another important source apart from Barani and Abu Fazl's own writings. So, therefore, this is how we have to look at his basically the life and his ideas, particularly in terms of the sources through which we can construct a kind of life sketch of this thinker. Now, of course, Mubarak, that is Sheikh Mubarak of Nagaur, that who was the father of Abu Fazl, came to Agra in 1543, and of course Mubarak had a reputation of learning and independence. In fact, so much so that in early years of Akbar's reign, when he declined to sign a fatwa signed by many scholars, theologians, who had permitted people to sell their children into slavery if faced starvation, and basically Sheikh Mubarak simply declined to sign such a fatwa or decree, saying that it was totally immoral and inhuman. So, this shows the autonomy and independence Abu Fazl's father basically enjoyed in terms of his intellectual autonomy. Now, of course, there are a lot of critics like Barani, who allays that his father, that is Sheikh Mubarak, also shifted allegiance to Sufism, because Sufism was on rise and was basically the favorable ideology so far as the Mughal emperors were concerned, particularly during the time of Akbar, and therefore he shifted allegiance. But in fact, Barani sometimes also appears to be unfair to both Abu Fazl and his father. Now, coming to Abu Fazl was born in 1551. Now, as I mentioned in the beginning, that his education was mainly from his father till he attained the age of 20. Of course, his elder brother was a poet. So, therefore, one can say that it was a family of scholars, it was a family of creative minds and a family of people of letters. Therefore, in fact, what we find that at the age of 20, we are also told that Abu Fazl got access to Emperor Akbar, and later on he became famous as Akbar's courtier, his friend and historian. So much so that for understanding Akbar's reign or the entire Mughal empire during this period, Abu Fazl's two important writings, which we will be discussing later, are the important sources. One is Akbarnama, another is Ain Akbari, two of the writings which are associated with Abu Fazl. Now, what happened that this closeness between Abu Fazl and Akbar has become legendary, so much so that it is believed that Akbar was often delighted by the kind of discourses which Abu Fazl used to give in Ibadat Khana, where basically he has not only contested, countered and demolished the established theologians of the regime. So, therefore, that this type of discursive ability which Abu Fazl had perhaps was was easy for him to befriend someone like Akbar, who considered Abu Fazl to be one of his most dependable ideologue and dependable friend. Now, Barani, as I mentioned earlier, that who happens to be the critic of both father and the son, he says that Abu Fazl had the habit of criticizing the traditional scholars, particularly ulemas and the theologians, largely on account of the fact that Abu Fazl stood for something which was not apologetic to the entire discourse on tradition, or rather one can say that he also always basically rebelled against tradition. He always rebelled against orthodoxy, and therefore, in fact, some of the critics like Barani point out that this didn't go down well with many established theologians of his time. Now, 1517, but one thing is also important here to note, that it was not only Abu Fazl but his father Mubarak, his influence was also on continuous rise. So much so that 1579, when famous declaration was made during the period, during the Akbar's regime, and that declaration gave the kind of title of just Sultan to Akbar, and also gave him the power to grant final interpretation on all disputed points of law. So, basically, instead of the ulemas, instead of theologians, in fact, the emperor Akbar was given this authority to have the final word on all disputed issues in law, and Mubarak appended his signature on that. But in fact, this was not the end of the matter, because Akbar was not going to be contented with this document, because eventually this became irrelevant for him, because he was up for something more. And therefore, what we find that later on this entire policy of Sulh-i-kul, or one can say the kind of discourse which Akbar initiated during his regime, that is Din-i-Ilahi, which basically combined the best features of all religion, or one can say that he in fact went to the extent of creating a new discourse on religion. All these things were part of this process which we have just mentioned, that how he took, he arrogated to himself this power to interpret all disputed issues in law instead of giving it to ulemas. It was the king who kept all these issues to himself. Now, what happens that new ideas on religion and the new ideas on worldly matters, in fact, one finds that what Akbar stood for, sometimes we get a very good idea of those those things through the writings of Abu Fazl, particularly the way he drafted or basically penned two important or three important documents, and of course a lot of scholars believe that they were basically drafted on behalf of Akbar. Now coming to those writings, as I was mentioning, the two of them stand out. One is Akbarnama and second is Ain-e-Akbari. In fact, one can say that Akbarnama is the official history of Akbar's reign. In fact, one can say that endorsed by Akbar or on behalf of Akbar. And in fact, Abu Fazl started writing Akbarnama in 1589 and he extended it till his death in 1602. Whereas the Ain-e-Akbari is concerned, Ain-e-Akbari is description of Akbar's empire in quite detailed manner. For example, it is a massive collection of statistics of prices, wages, revenues, and so on and so forth. It also contains a lot of ideas on Indian culture and so on and so forth. So these are some important issues or points to remember so far as these two important writings of Abu Fazl are concerned. Now what happens that Akbarnama and Ain-e-Akbari, in the opinion of many scholars, constitute a single book. Instead of calling them two different books, many people believe that they are part of the same writing, they are part of the same discourse. Of course, it is believed that this Akbarnama had three parts, and the first part of course was Akbarnama, which I have already mentioned, the official history of Akbar's regime. The second part is the account of Akbar's regime till 46th year, and the third part is Ain-e-Akbari, that is book on administration, revenue settlement, and so on and so forth. So therefore, instead of many scholars treating these two, Akbarnama and Ain-e-Akbari, as two different tracts, they consider both as part of the same writing, of course divided into three different parts. Now apart from this writing, what is also important to remember that Abu Fazl brought a new method to bear on his entire ideas, and methodologically therefore one can say that it was highly new and refreshing compared to what we find in Barani and some other medieval thinkers in India at that time. Now it is argued that Abu Fazl's entire method was rational in nature. He basically invoked reason so far as understanding history, society, East policies, and so on and so forth is concerned. Even in terms of his reflection on religion and faith, it was not simply guided by a kind of theological approach to religion. Rather, it was always based on a rational understanding of faith and religion. So much so that many people believe that largely on account of this fact that his entire approach to history was also quite secular. He didn't believe in conflict based on identities and differences in faith, and therefore the kind of policy which he propagated, and particularly through the discourse or through the policy called Sulh-i-kul, which I will basically discuss later, in fact was a policy which emerged out of such approach towards history, which can be called a secular approach. Now of course, apart from this, we can also find another new initiative, or one can say that new method being pressed into action here, and that is the method of collecting facts. In fact, the way this Ain-e-Akbari, he composed that book, in fact it is full of statistical details, which is basically can be matched, which can match even modern writings, or factual data, which normally is normally believed that it is a modern invention in social science, history, philosophy, and so on and so forth. But in fact, what we find that is Ain-e-Akbari is full of details. In fact, lot of data and facts he collected through number of sources. And of course, one thing is interesting here to see that he didn't accept any evidence or basically he didn't accept any fact on the face of it. He always questioned its validity, particularly its source, and adopted only when it satisfied the principle of historical investigation. So therefore, if his Akbarnama is an authoritative historical account of Akbar's regime, then one can say that kind of historical method and historical approach which we find emerging with Akbar, with Abu Fazl, is also quite refreshing and quite new. Of course, he also brought new tools to interpret history, particularly the philosophy of history, that how history moves. It was not simply divinely ordained events, or it is not simply the kind of replay of the wishes of God. Rather, he wanted, or rather he tried to give a new twist to this interpretation of history based on rationalism and so on and so forth. Therefore, we can see that in terms of method, certain new approaches are emerging with Abu Fazl in terms of collection of data, in terms of the way he cross-checked the eyewitnesses so far as collection of evidence is concerned, the way he collected and relied on reports, memoranda, on internal farmans of the Mughal Empire. So therefore, all these data, all these collection of facts, the way he marshaled them, the way he questioned them, the way he basically interpreted them appears to be quite significant and refreshing so far as his method is concerned. Now, coming to this influence part, as we have already seen that there are number of influences on him. One of the most important influence was, of course, his father, about whom we have already discussed. Medieval historian Irfan Habib in fact also says that one of the important influence on Abu Fazl was from Islamic tradition, and therefore particularly the kind of discourse which was in circulation in the Islamic scholarly traditions or in the Islamic world, that was Iba Arabi, that is basically the unity of existence. In fact, he imbibed that idea through his father, who was under the influence of this discourse. Of course, a lot of critiques point out that even Arabi was not a simple monotheism, which is normally made out to be. It was a complex monotheism, not a simple monotheism, but nonetheless, in fact, it was a doctrine of a monotheism, that is unity of existence, that at one plane, at one level, every every being, or one can say every creature or everything is united. The roots may be different, but end is the same. Now, it is from this discourse of Ibn Arabi that we find that his entire worldview flows. In fact, which he sums up to some extent in his Ain-e-Akbari in a very precise and cryptic manner. He says, what is religion? And he says, what is this world? And then he says that there is one heart and ensnaring beauty which casts a splendor through many thousands of veils, and they have spread an expansive carpet, and it sets forth many different colors. So this is how he puts it in Ain-e-Akbari through a passage, this influence of Ibn Arabi, which I mentioned as unity of existence discourse in the Islamic tradition. Now, of course, one can say that this is the starting point of his political thought as well. In fact, his entire political thought, if one turns to his political thought, one finds that his entire political thought is based on a secular understanding of society, secular understanding of authority, and secular understanding of power. In fact, he goes to the extent of putting religion and the secular sphere, that is this world, at par with, which was quite a significant development from the point of view of a medieval society and medieval thinking, that he considered the religious world and the secular world sharing the same pedestal, both at par with. So therefore, in order to basically bring the religious sphere at par with the secular sphere. In fact, he came out with many ideas, and some of those ideas are quite significant for understanding his entire political thought. Now, of course, he also mentions that both are equally illusory, and therefore they are product of false duality. That is, the religious world and the secular world are both illusory, and therefore product of the false duality. And this in effect liberates what he does by doing so, that liberates the temporal sovereignty from any dictates of theological doctrine, because theological influence or theological control on authority was so significant that it had to be questioned. And this is what Abu Fazl does in this tract, that is An-Akbari, particularly the passage I have quoted. Abu Fazl's political thought, what we have been discussing here, in fact, his entire evolution of his political thought, is normally traced to different influences which came to influence him, particularly the influence of his father, the Islamic tradition, and so on and so forth. But what is significant here to note, that Abu Fazl's political thought, because of number of influences and number of new and refreshing ideas which basically he initiated, is quite significant from the point of view of medieval political thinking in India. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the religion, he kept religion and the secular sphere at par with each other, and which was quite a significant development. At the same time, he also mentioned that both are equally illusory and both are the product of the false duality. But by making this a statement, what in effect he did, that he liberated temporal sovereignty from any dictates of theological doctrine, and it was not a mean achievement from any point of view. Now, so far his political thought is concerned, the question or the issue of sovereignty is quite important, because as I mentioned, that he elevated the temporal domain to a slightly more higher pedestal, and this elevation particularly becomes quite significant in terms of the entire understanding of sovereignty, power and authority. Now, how Abu Fazl locates the sovereignty of the state or the sovereignty of the empire? This is quite important. And then, in fact, what is significant to see here, that it is in this he locates sovereignty in the needs of social order. He doesn't locate sovereignty through any divine origin argument. He doesn't locate sovereignty through force. He doesn't locate sovereignty through any other argument which is now commonly prevalent in political theory and political science. In fact, rather he locates it in the needs of the social order. In fact, here the reasoning follows the pure dictates of reason, and therefore appealing to the tradition of philosophers and the scientists. So reason. Now this entire style of arguing about sovereignty was quite significant from the point of view of medieval political thinking. Now in Ain-e-Akbari, what Abu Fazl stresses is also his knowledge of classical Greco-Islamic scientific tradition, and this is quite significant, but we will come to this issue later. The scientific tradition, of course, he claims access to that tradition, but in fact he doesn't give any indication that how he tried to promote that scientific tradition in India during his time, neither through his proximity to Akbar nor through his own writings. We will basically come when we will take up the question of the limitations of Abu Fazl's political thought. Now coming to the next important issue, along with this question of sovereignty, which I mentioned that he locates in the needs of the social order, is the question of the origin of the state. And here the question of social contract becomes very important. Now we have seen earlier in the thought of Barani, Ziauddin Barani, that it was a divine origin theory. But on the other hand, in Abu Fazl, it is a different type of argument so far as the origin of the state is concerned. It is not surprising that he appeals to a theory of social contract to justify the necessity of political authority. I will basically quote one passage from Abu Fazl, which is quite significant to understand that how he provides justification through contract, how he basically locates the authority and the legitimacy of the authority of king and emperor through contract and through his deeds, particularly the interest of the people, which is basically one is reminded of the entire language of social contract as it is available in Western political theory with Hobbes, Locke and Rousseau. And interestingly, he comes before them. So therefore, it is equally significant. Now he writes that relief is not possible except through punitive power of single man. This life-saving medicine cannot be provided except through the terror of just rulers. How would the property, life, honor, and religion of world, of people be protected? This is the question. And then he says that the wages of protection, because ultimately it is the king who is supposed to give protection. And why people should obey, the king? Why should one obey the authority of the king? Because he is basically going to protect property, life, honor, and religion. So therefore, as I mentioned, that in the needs of the social order, he locates sovereignty in the needs of the social order. Now, he also writes, in fact, the wages of the protection of these issues which I have already enumerated, the wages of protection have to be paid to the sovereign, and for protecting four essential things in life, that is property, life, honor and religion. And then he adds that for such a task no taxes, wages could be considered too high, but just sovereigns, there is one rider he puts that the sovereign does not take more than what suffices for the task. So therefore, this give and take, that you give the sovereign the authority, you legitimizes his authority, you give him the power, and through contract, and the sovereign will give you protection. Something what we find in Hobbes' Leviathan, particularly the way he looks at the state between anarchy and monarchy. When Hobbes, Western modern political thinker, who basically in 17th century talked of this entire theory of social contract and he basically posited these two choices between anarchy and monarchy, either a authoritarian a rule of Leviathan or a kind of anarchic situation in a state of nature. So, similar argument we find coming through this statement of Abu Fazl. Of course, one also finds that Abu Fazl justifies the temporal sovereignty, and this is quite significant here. As I mentioned earlier, that before Abu Fazl, the theory which was more popular, which was in circulation, which was quite common, was the divine origin theory. But here we find a social contract theory coming into existence through such passages available in Abu Fazl's writing. Now, of course, he also mentions two different types of sovereign, the just sovereign and unjust sovereign, and he levers this point to great extent, that what is just sovereign and what is unjust sovereign. And then he also says that how the just sovereign be identified, because it is important to identify the just sovereign, which is not a very easy job. And therefore, in Ain-e-Akbari, he takes up this issue at the very beginning of the book, and in fact he discusses that who is the just sovereign, and therefore it is not just a chance that when he says that everyone is not entitled for this Badshah or Padshah, and Akbar is entitled for this thing largely on account of his reputation as a just sovereign. So the Badshah, the just sovereign, and therefore the kind of qualities which he enumerates for a just sovereign are all part of his larger discourse of sovereignty, political authority, and origin of a state. Now, what happens that in the entire discourse of this just and unjust sovereign, in the entire discourse on sovereignty, in his entire discourse of this elevation of temporal sphere or temporal sovereignty to higher plane, what we find that a third element also comes into the picture, and this is basically the theory, or one can say the influence of Ishraq theory, and this is very important. This Ishraq theory is quite important in the sense that this Ishraq theory was in circulation in the Islamic world, and therefore in fact what happens that Abu Fazl comes to this Ishraq theory in basically through his ideas on sovereignty, on political authority, and so on and so forth. Now, coming to this sovereignty, as I was mentioning, that he locates in the needs of social order and he follows the dictates of reason instead of any faith or any divinity. Now, what we also find that this social contract theory, through which he talks of the just and unjust thing, and how the just and unjust have to be identified, and it is here I mentioned that the entry of a third influence, that is basically the Ishraq theory. Now, what is this Ishraq theory? This is something important to remember. Now, this Ishraq theory in fact comes into play through the Western categories or through the Western political thought. Many people believe that it has its origin in the Greek political thought of Plato. Basically, Plato's Republic in fact is one such example, when a good is presented under the symbol of sun, the sun, and whatever is good, whatever stands for good is basically presented under the symbol of sun. Now, sun becomes the symbol of God, and therefore it is a derived spiritual light, something which illuminates the presence of each lower degree of influence. So therefore this entire thing is basically seen through this prism of or through the symbol of sun, and the symbol of sun becomes the symbol of God, and it is basically the symbol of a spiritual light which illuminates the presence of each lower creature. Now, it was developed in the Islamic world by another it was developed in the Islamic world by another scholar, and he was Maktul, and Maktul in the Islamic world popularized something what we have already discussed with reference to Plato in the Greek political thought. Now, Maktul's writings were read in the Islamic world, and therefore one can say that even Abu Fazl and his father were exposed to this Maktul's writing, so far as this entire theory of Ishraq is concerned. Now Abu Fazl also uses the imaginary of course, if not terminology of Ishraq tradition, when he puts temporal sovereignty at the highest station in the hierarchy of object receiving a spiritual light, and therefore to this unique Almighty there is no higher station than that of the king. So basically the entire purpose is to elevate the authority, the sovereignty of the king and the state to slightly higher pedestal, and therefore who is the just king and who is the unjust king? This is a question I posed earlier, that he says that it is important to identify the just king, and the just king is those who have this, who receive this light, this divine light. Therefore he became, the just king becomes the godly ruler who is long lasting, whereas the unjust ruler is not long lasting. Now therefore the just and unjust thing becomes very significant in Abu Fazl's writing. Now godly kings, therefore this godly kings who receive this spiritual light, what I talked of in context of Plato, what we talked of in context of Ishraq theory, we find in Abu Fazl, this comes in form of just and unjust ruler, and it comes in form of godly king, the king who has this spiritual light. Now godly king, according to Fazl, has certain qualities, and those qualities are quite important, and those qualities are that he stands for peace, he stands for justice, he stands for long lasting solution, whereas the unjust king stands for short lived rule, he stands for terror, he stands for cruelty, and he stands for theft. Of course he also is very clear in his thought that not all sovereigns receive this light, that is a spiritual light. Only few sovereigns receive this spiritual light, and whosoever receives becomes godly king or the just ruler, or one can say the Badshah. And therefore when he decided to give this title to Akbar, the Badshah, he believed that he symbolized that spiritual light, this godly qualities, and therefore in fact he believed that Akbar approximated to this entire theory of Ishraq, or what one can say the godly king. Of course one thing is also important, that he does not use the conventional Muslim adjective of God's shadow, which was quite popular in the Islamic political thought those days. Rather, in fact, in his writings, God, the king is not the shadow, he is rather recipient of the divine light, he is the possessor of illuminated wisdom, and he is a reflector of light received. So he is not a shadow, rather he is himself, he is the recipient of that light, therefore he can radiate. So therefore he basically makes lot of shifts in the the conventional thinking which was available in the Islamic political thought in those days. So therefore this is how we have seen the distinction between the just and unjust ruler, and therefore how he believes that Akbar deserved that title of a Badshah, because that divine light, he was the recipient of that divine light. Now of course, so far as the qualities of this godly king is concerned, as I was mentioning, he talks of number of qualities. The godly king has to have a strong will. The godly king has to have a God worshipping nature. The godly king has to have a quickness in giving relief to his subjects. So therefore one can find that a lot of qualities he enumerates, and it is here that a lot of people makes a distinction between Abu Fazl and Barani, that when it comes to Barani in fact doesn't give much importance to these qualities of godly king what Abu Fazl talks of. For Barani in fact other issues were more important. The issues were stability, the issue was hierarchy, the issue was nobility, whereas for Abu Fazl a different set of issues become important. The issue of tolerance, the issue of dealing with different faith or dealing with difference, which is a modern problem, and therefore it is some sort of achievement for a medieval political thinker to address this question in such a way where he basically invokes reason. He invokes number of things which emerge much later in India, and therefore Abu Fazl stands out as a very significant medieval political thinker. Of course, Abu Fazl in fact also talks of duality of religion, and he said that different kinds of persons receive comfort from his benevolence, that is the godly king. Now, duality of religion should not lead to the persecution. Duality of duality of religion in society should not lead to a kind of differentiation in terms of his livelihood, in terms of his rights. So therefore, what he believes that a godly king will treat all people of having different faiths, coming from different faiths and different religion, with the same benevolence which he treats people or the subjects of his own faith. Now, it is here that tolerance of the conflicting faith becomes very important, and this is what I was trying to argue in the beginning of my presentation, that is entire policy of tolerance which Akbar championed and what Abu Fazl propounds through his discourse of Sulh-i-kul, that is absolute peace, becomes very important. The Sulh-i-kul, that is the absolute peace, that means tolerance of all diversity. Tolerance of all diversity is basically the essence of this Sulh-i-kul. Now, of course, one also says that this higher form of Sulh-i-kul could be Muhabbat-e-kul, and Muhabbat-e-kul would be absolute love. But of course, if absolute love is not possible, then Sulh-i-kul is perhaps the most practicable and reasonable policy to adopt, and therefore, in fact, one can say that Sulh-i-kul is second best. Something the way Plato considered the government by laws as the second best, not the best. So similarly, one can say, using the same analogy, one can say that in Abu Fazl, Sulh-i-kul is his second best. If Muhabbat-e-kul, that is absolute love, the regime or the rule based on absolute love is not possible, then Sulh-i-kul is perhaps the best possible option. Now, of course, Abu Fazl in his writings also lists out number of successes he achieved in his life in achieving this Sulh-i-kul, particularly with the help of Badshah Akbar. Particularly, Akbar's regime is known for the kind of policy of tolerance which he espoused and championed. In fact, it is believed that like ancient King Ashok and his discourse of Dhamma, the medieval, particularly the Mughal Emperor Akbar and his policy of Deen-i-Ilahi and Sulh-i-kul, they basically marked the beginning of this new discourse of tolerance in the medieval period, which was basically kind of plagued with the kind of theological, or one can say religious strife, particularly under the influence of theology and theologians, particularly the ulemas during the Sultanate period and also during the reign of some Mughal emperors. So therefore, this is quite important, and it is here for understanding the Sulh-i-kul, one is also reminded of this invocation of Ibn Arabi's, particularly the philosophy of Ibn Arabi, which I mentioned in the beginning, which had a tremendous influence on his father. And Irfan Habib, the medieval historian, says that the influence of Ibn Arabi was also quite visible on Abu Fazl. Now, Sulh-i-kul, of course, is something what can be translated as the policy of tolerance, and this policy of tolerance is at the basis of modern secularism, that how to treat differences, how to not discriminate among different faiths and different religions, and this is what Sulh-i-kul stood for. In fact, one thing is also important, that this Abu Fazl also provides certain method to achieve this policy of Sulh-i-kul, and the three important methods which he proposes for attaining this Sulh-i-kul is: number one, from speech to silence; number two, from friendship with the good people, good men; and the third, making peace with the bad, that is bad people. if three things are adopted, Sulh-i-kul, that is the tolerance of all diversity, will be attained. And this is how he looked at this policy of Sulh-i-kul. Now, of course, for ruler, the Sulh-i-kul meant the tolerance of all differences in society. In fact, therefore, what we find that in Abu Fazl goes to the extent of enumerating the number of steps and initiatives which Akbar took to basically institutionalize this policy of Sulh-i-kul from 1578 to 1579. In fact, he says that Akbar opened a discourse with the leading men of all religions, Christians and Brahmins. Number two, he appointed men of different faith in high places, which is well known. And the third, particularly, the Navratna in his darbar, in his court. And the third is that he faced quietly uproar from orthodox, because orthodox opinion rebelled against him, questioned him, challenged him, but he basically faced all of them quietly. And therefore, Abu Fazl believes that this is how Akbar tried to institutionalize this discourse of Sulh-i-kul. Of course, Sulh-i-kul is a philosophical position difficult to practice in opinion of Abu Fazl, and therefore he says that if any one faces problem in practicing it, then the best alternative is to leave it to God. That is the alternative to Sulh-i-kul, but the ideal is the Sulh-i-kul. Now, coming to the other issue of Abu Fazl, one thing is also important that Abu Fazl, there are a lot of people who also point out that there are many limitations in Abu Fazl's political thought, and we will also look at some of those limitations apart from the kind of achievements we have already mentioned in terms of propounding this policy of Sulh-i-kul state policy and so on and so forth. Of course, limitation is that he talks of benevolence, but nonetheless his ideas remain wedded to despotism. Of course, in fact, he talked of reason, but there was no tradition of reason in the Ishraq doctrine which he basically imbibed. Of course, he talked of reason, but there was no development of rationalism under the Mughals, particularly during the time of Abu Fazl and Akbar. And number three, that he talked of rationalism, but that didn't lead to any scientific development when the scientific developments were taking place in the Western world, and therefore it remained untouched with those developments. So a lot of scholars point out that these limitations are also there. Number two, one is also, he is also criticized at times for giving a conflicting statements, because sometimes his entire theory of the origin of a state appears to be contractual, but at times language also becomes something as a divine origin theory. So therefore, one scholar has pointed out that sometimes he combines both James I and Thomas Hobbes, which are the conflicting positions. And similarly, he gives a very good account of Akbar. He gives a very good account of Akbar's policy of tolerance, his entire policy of dealing with difference, but he does not discuss Akbar's shortcomings. For example, historians point out that Akbar was very soft towards caste system. Particularly Irfan Habib and other historians point out that the weakest link in the Mughal empire was its legislative weakness. It didn't legislate, and therefore it didn't legislate on social questions, social issues, and caste system remained untouched. And therefore, in fact, Akbar also, in spite of his progressive thinking and very illuminating policies, he didn't address these issues. Similarly, the caste system, as I have already mentioned. So these are some of the criticisms which are often mentioned in context of Abu Fazl and his endorsement of Akbar. But so far as achievement is concerned, of course, the kind of discourse of justice we find coming forth through his writings is something quite significant from the point of view of medieval political thought. His entire description of administration of Mughal period is also equally significant, and therefore on basis of Akbarnama and Ain-e-Akbari, what we construct his political thought stands out as something quite significant from the point of view of 16th century India. I will stop here.
With this note, thank you, sir. Thank you so very much. And dear friends, if you want to give your feedback for this particular lecture, then you can mail us at info.cc@nic.in. We would be meeting again very soon and would be talking more on Indian political thought. Till then, take care. Goodbye. Thank you, sir. Thank you so very much.